The following presentation is part of the Technology and the Corporation Conference Series, sponsored by MIT's Industrial Liaison Program.
There we go. Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. It's also a pleasure to follow Karen. You have to come down to Sao Paulo to learn about what people are doing at MIT and realizing there's a lot of connection in what we're both going to say. I have had the distinct pleasure in the last year of working on the topic of innovation in Brazil and the system of innovation in Brazil with our research partner, Senai, who is sponsoring research at MIT to look at the system of innovation in Brazil and particularly how it relates to the new institutes of innovation that Senai have set up in the last few years. So today I'd like to talk about some high-level reflections that I have observed and would like to make about the innovation system in Brazil, as well as use a few case studies that come from Massachusetts specifically, that build on MIT's role in the ecosystem, but talk more broadly about some developments around particular clusters and areas in Massachusetts. So to begin with, I want to talk about a few perspectives on innovation in Brazil, things that I've been hearing or reading in the last 9 to 12 months that provide, I think, different perspectives, but there's an element of truth probably in all of what has been said here. So first, we've poured billions of dollars into the innovation in Brazil, and we're not sure we have much to show for it, something that I've heard a number of people say. Secondly, that in fact, the essence of innovation, the innovation process, which requires flows of knowledge, people, networks, et cetera, is stymied in Brazil, that the firms, in fact, are isolated on some level. Finally, despite all of this, that the future of innovation in Brazil is promising. If we give it another 10 years, we will see results. And I will say ahead of time that at this stage in our research, and we have another 4 or 5 years to go, we're strongly falling into the third camp. And I'm going to show a few, again, high-level ideas about what we see in terms of trends that I think are important. Now, behind all of this, of course, are the structural challenges, and much has been written, excellent work done in this country by many people in this room here today about the key challenges for Brazil that are involved in legal frameworks, regulatory frameworks, cost related to protectionism, et cetera. I understand those exist. I'm not going to get down into the weeds of those, but we can discuss them at the end of my presentation. But I do just want to acknowledge in a very high level where we see changes just in the last 10 years in Brazil. So to begin with, before I begin on those changes, let me just also remind ourselves there's a tendency, we use the term systems of innovation, ecosystem, et cetera, a lot, and perhaps we overuse it without understanding or defining why we do. And I just want to remind ourselves, and Karen mentioned this before, about why this is important, why we think about this in terms of systems. The first is that innovation is not linear, that it has a reiterative process, that there's a recursive process between basic research to commercialization that is important. Secondly, it's highly interactive. Gone are the days that innovation took place in the vertically integrated corporation from beginning to end. Without the interaction of today, we see suppliers, customers, even competitors, universities, all playing a role in the innovation process. Innovation is geographically mediated. That is to say that proximity matters, that we find that innovation happens in places where we have a collection of inputs that help facilitate innovation, and that we can find the world is not flat, but it's spiky, if you've heard that phrase before, that lots of places, usually in regional economies, that have the capability of specialization and therefore innovation. And then finally, that innovation is shaped by institutions and culture, and that both of these can change over time and evolve over time. And we have certainly even seen that in Massachusetts. Home of computers, lost the PC market to California, came back roaring with biotech, a whole host of things in terms of culture and institutions that can change over time. And I think this is important also in the Brazilian context, where one hears so often people discussing culture as an important element to the innovation discussion. So I'm going to talk about 5 directions or 5 trends that we see right now in Brazil that I think are important to highlight. Again, just in the last 10 years that many of you have written about again, but I think are important to highlight. First, new R&D centers in Brazil, R&D centers that are globally connected. So again, based on the informatics law and the Lei do Bem, the good law just over a decade ago, there was incentives for corporations, for businesses to invest in R&D centers and receive tax benefits for that purpose, for doing so. So what have we seen over just the last 5 years? We have seen enormous increases in investment in R&D centers over this time period, primarily in ICT and oil and gas. But importantly, these are not just your run-of-the-mill R&D centers. These are actually integral to corporate global R&D networks. So to begin with, you might have seen R&D investments as kind of window dressing for some of these companies. At this point, we see significant types of innovation, significant investments being made with the idea that these centers are going to be part of a global network. In GE, it's one of 9 global centers, IBM, one of 12, Microsoft, one of 4. This has important implications both for the training and for the spillover effects, I think, for Brazil's innovation economy. Second, the role of public funding. Again, there has been an enormous amount of input on the innovation agenda, and if this is a chart that just shows BNDES and FINEP investments, both in reimbursable and non-reimbursable, over the last few years in terms of incentives to corporations and businesses to incent innovation. Now, it's too early to say what the impact of these are. We haven't evaluated them, and I think they absolutely need evaluation because it's in the details that we're going to understand how these incentives and these investments have worked. But again, an important and increasing investment on the innovation agenda from the public sector. Third, human capital. Now, this chart shows graduates in engineering relative to GDP across several countries. And Brazil, obviously, looking in a precarious position and a place that needs to obviously be moving up, if not over, to the right. But what we do know is that in the last 10 years, the number of engineering graduates in Brazil has increased by 300%. And the number of master's and PhD students in engineering has increased by 100%. So while the engineering capacity here has certainly not been reached, we do see important progress. We do see trends moving in the right direction, and there's debates as to what's crowding out the engineering, et cetera, or who's crowding out. But what we hear from talking to some of the large corporations in the country is that they are actually finding the talent they need and have been very satisfied with that talent. Fourth, institutional innovations. This, I think, is a sign of real creativity and also emphasis by the leadership about understanding that the old institutions may not be well situated or well positioned for taking on new opportunities in today's economy. So I just want to talk about a few institutions that express, in my mind, innovation that's very exciting going forward. And the first I'm going to talk about is CNPM, the Brazilian Center for Research in Energy and Materials, just created a few years ago, essentially an umbrella that oversees 4 national labs. And the hope is that that will provide some cross-fertilization across those 4 labs, that both basic and applied research would be taking place. For those who are familiar with Pasteur's quadrant, it's sort of the upper right quadrant, and that they're also open to interaction with industry, and that there are opportunities for engaging industry at the early stage of basic as well as applied research. I think a very exciting prospect for Brazil in this area. The second is what I mentioned earlier, Senai's Institutes of Innovation. For those of you who are not familiar with this, this is a network of innovation institutes based on the Fraunhofer model in Germany, which provides centers focused on particular technologies, working with businesses, both small and large, on trying to do applied research. And by subsidizing some of the work with industry, the hope is that industry invests more in product and process innovation. And I think what's interesting about this is not only the prospects for working with companies on the ground, but also the network itself, and how does a network of these centers work together and work collaboratively. I think it also provides a real laboratory for Brazil. Given the heterogeneity across regions, across industries, it will be very interesting to see how these institutes actually work in the various different contexts. Third, I just want to mention Embrapa, which I've translated poorly into a Brazilian industrial research and innovation effort. As many of you know, this was introduced. Essentially, it is an institution or a social enterprise that provides funding to innovation institutes that meet a certain criteria. So in fact, what it's trying to do is upgrade Brazil's institutions that are focused on innovation and do so through financial incentives. Again, I think a fundamental effort to try and to change and reorient institutions that are working on the innovation agenda. Both of these last two, in fact, I should mention, were ideas, I gather, from May in the last several years. So again, I think a very exciting time for institutional change and innovation in the country. Fourth, I'm going to talk about universities, and this speaks a little to what Karen just talked about the process of taking invention to the marketplace. Universities as an engine of innovation in the marketplace is something that every country, every region is focused on and working on. I wanted to put out here just some statistics to show where things stand today. And I've put MIT, Stanford, Harvard, and Unicamp lined up across the board here. And I want to make a simple point, and that is that the technology licensing offices in those first three places were formed in the 1970s. 45 years of trying to figure out how to do this. Stanford's first year in 1970, they made $50,000. They had 28 disclosures. They had 3 licenses. Things have changed since then, and you can see in terms of worldwide patents as well. But what's interesting to me is that in just over 10 years, Unicamp is on the tech transfer map. That in a very short period of time, that university and others in Brazil are trying to understand and figuring out the tech transfer process, a complicated process that is as much art as science, one might say. In any case, I think that what we see is that in all of these cases, Brazil has a lot of opportunity going on, a lot of changes happening in a relatively short period of time. And as many would say, that university inventions take 10 to 15 years to actually move from the actual invention out to the marketplace. So we need to keep this in mind when we think about the university-industry relationships and particularly in a lot of the concerns that have been expressed about how that's evolving and how that works. So overall, private sector investment, public sector investment, human capital development, institutions that are innovating, the university role, all of those in our minds showing promising trends in a relatively short period of time when it comes to building institutions of innovation and ecosystems. All of these are critical parts and factors in the ecosystem, and the question is how we bring them together and how they work together. Now I'd like to switch. I'm going to talk about 2 different cases, if you will, that highlight the building of innovation ecosystems, the time and complexity it takes, and the success and the challenges of doing so. And both of these are cases that come out of the Boston-Cambridge area. I think in part it helps speak to what we know best, which is MIT's role in these. But I'm going to start, if I might, with the biotech cluster in Boston. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. This is biopharma, biotech. And the question is, what does it take to build a world-class biotech cluster? At this point, I think it's fair to say that Boston's biotech cluster is perhaps the leading biotech center in the world, just sort of nudging out California, the Silicon Valley area. But what exactly were the elements that helped build that cluster? Well, first, it took a scientific revolution. That's always helpful in building the elements of a cluster. The in discovery of recombinant DNA in the 70s led to enormous opportunities and investments, of course. And that investment in the Boston area was essentially about 20 years of $2 billion a year of federal funding coming into the region, coming into some of those institutions that Karen highlighted, Mass General Hospital, Dana-Farber, Harvard, MIT. Very, very critical sort of push toward doing more biomedical research. Next, of course, world-class research institutions and institutional innovation as well. So we've talked about some of the institutions, but also innovations around trying to promote cross-disciplinary research. Starting in the 80s with the Whitehead Institute at MIT, the Broad Institute between Harvard and MIT in the 2000s, most recently at MIT, the Koch Center for Integrative Cancer Research, again, trying to bring the biologists, chemistry, computer science, bioengineering, et cetera, all together under one roof to try and push more innovation and create greater synergies across the institute. Of course, significant entrepreneurial failure. We hear about the successes. Biogen, Genzyme, founded in the late 70s and early 80s, but the failure cannot be underestimated. It's still the case that 50% of drug targets in phase 3 clinical trials fail in biotech, and that the average cost for bringing a drug to market is about $1 billion, though precision medicine is reducing that cost structure. In any case, biotech has rarely been overall profitable, but it has been extremely successful for certain investors. So to understand the biotech is to understand failure first and then success. Finally, the strategic alliances with big pharma, and I think this is incredibly important when it comes to thinking about scale-up and successful scale-up for startups. In biotech, for a whole host of reasons, they have had the good fortune, one would say, of having pharma as a ready investor and potential acquirer of the startups. They provide not only the capital during that long development stage, long development timeline, but also expertise and help on distribution, marketing, et cetera. So big pharma became an incredibly important part of this ecosystem, to the extent that in 2000, Novartis moved its international R&D headquarters to the Cambridge area. Now almost every leading biopharma company has R&D capabilities in the Cambridge area. So all of those help building this cluster to lead to the global center of biotech R&D and entrepreneurship. And I want to mention as well, just because I did my own research on the topic of commercial, of the biomanufacturing aspects of this, that in fact that the Massachusetts and the states in general has been historically the center for commercial biomanufacturing. That is to say that early stage piloting all the way through commercial biomanufacturing was done in the States right through for about 20 years because of the challenge of the scale-up process. Since the mid-2000s, that manufacturing has moved offshore to locations like Singapore and like Ireland, even like Switzerland, where they have great talent as well as significant tax breaks. And so as the process is standardized, the commercial aspects of that have moved offshore, and that's been sort of a part of the product life cycle in this industry. But interestingly, I think with high-end jobs and with complexity to it, that has made it a very interesting development opportunity for countries that want to get into biotech and possibly move from the downstream manufacturing upstream. So 45 years, at least $40 billion in public money, equally that, if not more, on the private side, a whole host of factors that help build this cluster and this center of excellence. I'm now going to move to a second system of innovation, and one that has a little bit of a different story, connected again to Karen's story, and that is about manufacturing. And it may be surprising to people to know that Massachusetts actually has a significant and vibrant manufacturing base. It's only 9% of employment, but it's a foundational capabilities that help support industries like aerospace defense, semiconductors, medical devices, biopharma, essentially providing the undergirding to a lot of the innovation that happens in those industries. But what we found in some work we did at MIT a few years ago called Production in the Innovation Economy was that the relationship between manufacturing and innovation, while critically important to the innovation process, was suffering in the US because of the disinvestment in manufacturing over a 20-year period. That as companies became vertically disintegrated and fragmented their supply chains, outsourced a lot of their work, that it created holes in our industrial ecosystem. And holes that need to be filled if the U.S. is going to remain competitive in terms of its innovation capabilities through manufacturing capabilities. So in some recent work, we looked at this question through the lens of Massachusetts, and what does it mean in terms of the innovation ecosystem in Massachusetts? So let me just say briefly that the ecosystem as we see it for innovation in manufacturing involved 4 key parts. Small and medium-sized businesses, the suppliers, large OEMs, the large manufacturers, the startup community, and the universities. And what we found, again, through our research and through interviews, is we tried to understand what's the relationship between these. We have all those factors, all these great inputs into the ecosystem. How do they relate to each other? So what we know is that a lot of innovation is driven by large OEMs to the small and medium-sized companies. Universities and OEMs have a strong relationship in terms of information flow and knowledge flows. Startups drive a lot of innovation to the OEMs. Universities are obviously leading out to startups. And startups have a very weak and tenuous position relative to the supplier base. Often it's by word of mouth that they're finding suppliers who help them through their prototyping and their piloting phase. So what I want to do is talk specifically about the startup piece, and this is, I think, interesting in terms of what matters for an ecosystem and how do we build them. So what we did as part of this PI project is look at MIT startups coming out of the Technology Licensing Office that had some production capabilities. That is to say, they were involved not in software, but in creating products that involved some production capabilities. So biopharma and medical devices, about 60%, no surprise given that federal funding, of the startups out of the TLO were in these 2 categories. Another 10% advanced materials and energy, also in semiconductors and also in robotics. And what we did is we looked at a 15-year period. Firms that were founded between 1997 and 2008. So it would give us a window into how these firms scaled up after 5 or 15 years in the marketplace. And what we found of the group is that their current status, about 60% still operating. That's a very high percentage relative to what you'd find in the national average. About 20% had closed, about 20% had been acquired. Now, if you look at VC-backed companies generally in the US, you'd find about 30%, over 30% have been acquired, and about the same amount closed or a little bit less. The M&A aspects of scale-up have become more and more important for startups, and that's something else we can discuss afterward. But what we did is we said, okay, we'd like to know how these companies have grown to scale. So what we did is we looked at companies that had at least $5 million in revenue or had raised at least $50 million in venture capital. And of the 150 companies, only 15 had revenue over $5 million over this period of time. Of that, 3 had hit 100 million, 1 had hit $1 billion. So it gives you an idea of sort of what the timeline is here for getting to market and becoming profitable. So what do we find out talking to these firms about their scale-up process? First, we found out that the U.S. and many places like Boston, San Francisco, Austin, et cetera, have a very robust startup ecosystem. What are the elements of that system? First, risk capital. About over half of these startups had received risk capital. On average, it was about $70 million, and it lasted for 8 to 10 years, much longer than we had expected. But again, as Karen talked about, these are often companies that have a longer time horizon and more complex scale-up process because they're involved in manufacturing capabilities. What else mattered? The thick labor markets of high intellect talent. So these are companies that are located and locating near engineering schools, places where they can find the talent, both the material scientist, the mechanical engineer, and the biochemist. National and international networks. These companies early on, they were able to, through their networks, find specialized investors who might only invest in nanotech, for example, or understood the challenges of that. They could find customers, potentially inviting, as we had one company, they invited Sony in to hear the pitch. Sony was very interested. They immediately knew that they had something and they could run with it. They had visionaries, people, often investors, who would pick and choose parts of technology from different places and try and bring it together. So those networks are critically important. Finally, thick supplier markets. For all of these companies, the process of bringing, the early stages of bringing a product to market requires prototyping and piloting. It could be a 3-month process, it could be a 3-year process. What they need is rapid prototyping and turnaround, 24/7 support from a supplier network, which, again, important and existed in these cases. In all of the cases, though, time trumps everything. The question of getting a new product to market was very important, and I think this question of time and how this happens in Brazil is quite relevant. So here we are with companies that have at least 70 million has been raised. They've been in operation for 8 to 10 years. Now they just have to make that leap to demonstrating viability at scale. What happens to these companies? Well, what we found is that the US ecosystem actually falters at this point. As these companies are searching for complementary assets, they're looking for financing, they're looking for capabilities at scale, the US system is not there supporting in those particular ways. You need a significant influx of new capital. You see this particularly in energy, but in all of these areas where you're trying to demonstrate at scale, you have to invest in facilities that will do that. A VC model is not going to support the financing of that. So what did we find happen? What happens to these companies? They can turn to 2 sources right now. Either foreign governments that help provide that capital along with other resources, or strategic partners, as Karen pointed out in her experience. And in many cases for these technologies, foreign governments have been very aggressive and very interested in investing in these technologies from a portfolio perspective. So they provide non-dilutive capital. They might provide resources in land, in other areas of training, and they help the company to set up and scale their operations abroad. And this may be good for the investor. It's good for the company. It makes a lot of sense. But from a US perspective, we ask ourselves, what are we losing in the process? Because that work is not codified manufacturing. That is a learning by building process in which those capabilities head offshore. The other option is going with strategic partners, as Karen mentioned. And what we see in the States now is that strategic partners, more and more, are becoming early investors in our startups and an important part of the scale-up process, particularly for companies that have longer development cycles. So they're involved in licensing, joint ventures. They provide technological capabilities. In some cases, they're even creating their own development outposts, if you will, to help create companies that will be potential venture investments. So very aggressive in trying to drive innovation because, as we know, the large companies have, in many cases, a more challenging time at that. The other aspect that's happening from an ecosystem point of view, what we see in Massachusetts, is that intermediaries are now trying to bridge this relationship between the startup and the strategic. We have 3 examples, at least in Massachusetts, where Clean Energy Council has created a strategic partners effort to try and bring strategic energy-related companies to startups. FinTech Sandbox is financial services, technology startups. Fidelity and other, Reuters, a lot of data companies are providing scrub data to the the startups to help them iterate and innovate in their space. And then finally, Partners Healthcare, one of the largest healthcare systems in the country, involved in bringing healthcare IT pilots into the hospitals to try and understand how we do kind of clinical trials, if you will, for these. So all of these are critically important in the process of helping the startup cross the chasm, if you will, and develop products that can be demonstrated viability at scale and can also find customers early on. The other point I want to make is also the idea of subsidizing scale-up in the US. They're concerned about losing capabilities here, and so there has been a proposal put forth by the Obama administration about a public-private fund that would help with first-of-a-kind facilities and investment. So I'm going to stop there. I'm right on time, which is rare. And I'm going to just to say that both of these cases, I hope, have shown both the long time that's taken to build capabilities and ecosystems in places like Boston, the challenges in doing so, And the fact that this is a complex process that is not something that we should be expecting results from immediately. There's still, in the US, we're still figuring out certain aspects of our ecosystem, just as Brazil is figuring out elements of yours. So in sort of conclusion, and this is, again, at a very high level, I would just say a few things about implications for Brazil about what we've seen to date. The first is to stay the course. Some people have said, well, if we don't see results soon, we've got to stop. That would be a mistake. We're at the early stages of a long road, and I think that there's a lot of positive signs. Secondly, evaluating initiatives, evaluating what we're learning here through all of these new efforts, and evaluating at the project level. Because it's at the project level that we understand the relationships and what we might call the stickiness and the friction that is involved in the innovation process. And I think that's where we hear a lot about the challenges in Brazil. And this is, in some ways, the sand in the gears, that the structural issues that have been talked about are like sand in the gears, around time, around cost issues, all of that getting in the way of the innovation process. And finally, I think learning from successes. There are a number of successes, both from the company level, from an industry level, from an institutional level, that we can learn a lot from, and that I think we hope to be part of the process with you. So thank you very much.